All right, I am here with the one, the only, Courtland Allen from Indy Hackers. How you doing, man?
Pretty good. How you doing, Pat?
Pretty good. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've been excited about this 24-hour startup challenge for the last couple of weeks. I was actually in Dublin and London going to Andy Hackers meetups, and everybody there was talking about it and asking me what I was going to build. Unfortunately, my answer is nothing. I'm just working on the Andy Hackers website, but thanks for having me on here. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, man, of course. Can you give us a little bit of a background of what Indie Hackers is, and then also just you personally?
Yeah, so I got to start by saying that traditionally it's pretty tough to be an early stage founder. It's pretty solitary. Unless you know all the right people, you end up building your business alone. And like the only role models you've traditionally had are people who are building these huge businesses that are hard to relate to because they're the only people that the press will cover. And so you end up having to learn most of your lessons through that experience, which kind of sucks. Um, Indie Hackers is a community of entrepreneurs who come together to help each other build successful businesses. And they do this by sharing their knowledge, their stories, their experiences, and by answering each other's questions and giving each other direct feedback on the forum. And so the goal of Indie Hackers is really to inspire more people to start businesses, to show that, hey, it's really possible. There's more than one way to start a company, and you can do it to really accomplish any sort of goal you want for yourself, whether that's financial freedom or whether that's sort of the opposite end of the spectrum and you want to change the world in some way. We've got examples of all those things, and we just try to help people build more successful businesses as well.
Awesome. All right, so I want to get into the Indie Hackers movement a little bit later, but I want to hear more about you and your personal journey. What is your journey to becoming a programmer or a maker? And I know that you actually I won't give anything away, but how does that go from college and learning how to program, and then
hmm
also walk us through how you got to Indie Hackers?
Yeah, so it's like a lifelong story there. That's a lot. I'll try to blow through it. I've been a nerd since I was a little kid. I remember being 8 years old playing on my mom's computer, and I got a lot of encouragement from the adults around me. They all said like, "Oh, you're a computer whiz. You're gonna be rich someday." And it's funny looking back. I understand why they were saying that. That was like the late '90s when the first tech boom was happening, and like anyone who touched a computer sort of got this validation that like this is something special. But as a kid, I just liked being on computers all the time. And so pretty close to that, like my biggest role model in the world was Bill Gates, who kind of showed that you could be a nerd and you could spend all your time on the computer and it could still be cool. Um, and I decided like from a young age that I wanted to go to MIT and be a computer programmer. I think when I got to college, things changed a little bit because I started reading Paul Graham's essays, which I'm sure many people on the stream have read. And Paul Graham had, he was sort of a voice in the wilderness saying that like you can start a startup, here's what you need to do. And he gave very practical advice for how you could start a company. And I think listening to what he said sort of switched my path from I want to be a computer programmer to like I want to use computer programming to start my own businesses and run my own companies. And so I learned to code in college, basically. So before college, I was doing a lot of web design. I was doing HTML and CSS, but I wasn't really programming. I wasn't building web applications. But during college, one of my roommates turned to me and said, "Hey, let's make a Facebook app." And I was like, "Well, I don't know how to do that." And he's like, "No, it's easy. We'll just figure it out." And he sort of instilled the confidence in me that I could do this because he was so confident that we could do it. So we made this sort of useless Facebook application. This is like 2008, like right after Facebook released its SDK. And it let you check your Gmail on Facebook. And it was called Fmail. And it was really pointless. It was just Gmail inside of Facebook, and it was skinned to look like Facebook. But we got a lot of like press off the back of it just because it was a quirky thing. And I think, after that, I was like, all right, well, it's not the hardest thing in the world to take a project from, idea to releasing it out. I got a lot of cool contract gigs as a result of that. And that was sort of the beginning of like my career as like a programmer and like a startup founder. How far do you want me to go? I mean, I can go all the way. I can go failed startup after failed startup all the way through.
Yeah. Why don't you walk us through a couple of your fail? Because I know you did YC. I'd love to hear
Yep.
about that transition from the YC idea to build this big company to then Indie Hackers, which is like the not the polar opposite, but it's definitely a different way
hmm
of looking at things. So I'd love to hear some of your failed ideas and how you got there.
Yeah. So off the back of that, I met a couple other grad students at school who wanted to work on an email related application. And I got kind of sucked into this black hole of building stuff for Gmail for like the next 5 years of my life because of this random app that I ended up making. But we made this app called Cipher. And the idea was that you could sort of make advanced filters for your Gmail. So Gmail already lets you filter things like if it comes from this person, apply this label. If it comes from this email address, mark it as red or star it. But with our app, you could do things like if it comes at this time of day, then I want you to, delay it until the future. Or if it has this many attachments, or, if I haven't read it, you can even filter on past emails. If I haven't read this email in the last 6 hours and archive it, et cetera. So we built that, and it was also pretty popular. It took me like 9 months to build it, but we ended up not charging any money for it. And it sort of crashed and burned because we ran out of money. We didn't have any funding, and that was it. Like, my partners had to go get a job, and I moved to SF and started looking for a job. And around this time, I was also really interested in applying to Y Combinator. I had watched like every startup school talk ever. I had read Paul Graham's essays earlier, and I thought, like, and this is the ticket. Like, if I could avoid getting a job, I could go to YC. They'll give me, I think at the time it was like $17,000 in funding to run your startup. I can live off that for a few months and like make my dream a reality. But the number one speaker that I watched at these startup school talks was this guy, David Heinemeier Hansen. And he got on stage and gave this famous talk that I always link people to now, where he basically just shat on everyone who came before him and said, don't listen to these investors, don't listen to any of these people. What you should be doing with your startup is just charging money for it. You don't need to be a unicorn. You don't need to reach billions of people. You can just put a price tag on what you're doing, build something of value, and make like a nice, I think he called it a nice Italian restaurant on the internet. And that really rang true with me because I had already built, several products that had failed simply because I didn't charge money for them and I couldn't raise money from investors. And so by the time I got into YC with another email app, I was sort of infected with this idea that I should charge money. This is winter of 2011. This is before Stripe even really existed. And so it wasn't an easy thing to charge money. That was like a month's of work, of like programming work and talking to banks on the phone if you wanted to charge money for whatever you're building. And so my partner and I worked on this other app called Task Force in YC. We ended up not charging money for that either. I remember talking to Paul Graham about it, and he was like, yeah, just try. He was convinced that the email inbox is sort of this gateway, sort of this Trojan horse into a bigger opportunity. And so he was convinced that we should get as many users as we possibly could. And we did. We got something like 100,000 people to sign up for this app, Task Force, that let you convert your emails into tasks. And most of them weren't retained. We didn't really, nothing magical happened as a result of getting that many people. Investors weren't particularly blown away. And so again, for the third time, I found myself in the situation where I built something that people seemed to like, that was solving a problem, but that, it wasn't a real business because we weren't charging money for it. So fast forward 6 months, summer 2011, Stripe finally releases its beta program. And in the space of like a day, we put a price tag on Task Force and it makes $2,000 in its first weekend. And we were charging, recurring. So all those people were going to pay again. And that was sort of the first magic moment where I was like, okay, it's possible to actually build a business on the internet and make money for it. And growing it is not easy, but, it's better than sort of, crossing your fingers and hoping that like investors will open up their checkbook and sort of pay you to keep building your app in the hopes that something magical happens in the future, which in 2011, like that was what everybody was doing because the biggest unicorns were Facebook and Twitter. And they were sort of preaching this gospel of you have to get a lot of users in the door today and then figure out how to make it work later. Nowadays, like most of the unicorn companies people look up to are all revenue generating. They all have very obvious, straightforward business models, Uber, Airbnb, Instacart, Stripe, et cetera. But back then it was completely crazy and charging money was like a very, investors looked at you like you were crazy. And so that was sort of my beginning of my foray into like building businesses that could actually generate revenue on the internet. And I started a couple after that, none that really blew up, all of which made, at least $1,000 or $2,000 a month in revenue at some point during their lifetime. All the way up until the point where I started Indy Hackers. And that was in the summer of 2016. So I can go into that story if you'd like, but I've been talking for a long time, so I'm going to pause and let you jump in.
Well, it sounds like maybe it's just random, but you have a lot of email projects. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the thing is, you start building expertise in an area and you start, learning things and then wanting to capitalize on those learnings. And you reach out to other people who are in the same area. And so it's really easy to get sucked in to one particular area and then just stay there because you're comfortable.
Yeah. Okay. So, Indy Hackers, how did you come up with the idea for that? And like, it sounds like it was a very different idea than some of the email stuff that you've been working on and this to-do app that you're working on. So how did you just come up with this idea? And the idea was very unique, in my opinion, and obviously,
Yeah.
it's kind of changed the game a lot. So, how'd you come up with that?
So Indie Hackers, I started working on in the summer of 2016. I had just quit a contract job, so I got kind of burned out in my late 20s from doing startups. I decided I was just going to contract, make money, maybe do some projects on the side. I did that for a couple years and then quit and said, okay, I've got a year of runway. I'm going to start another business. And again, like the beginning of that year, I just kind of fucked around and worked on things without much of a plan. And then I got serious and said, okay, I'm eating through my runway. I'm living in SF. The rent is very expensive. I can't afford to just waste time. I need to be more systematic about how I come up with ideas. And so I took everything that I had learned from previous projects, everything that I learned from reading Paul Graham's essays and talking to other founders and going through YC, and I sort of just made this validation checklist. I was like, I'm not going to work on any idea that doesn't score pretty high on this validation checklist. And then I went through my list of like hundreds of ideas that I'd come up with over the years, and I just filtered it down, and it turned out that none of them scored high on my validation checklist. So I'm like screwed. I'm like, I don't know what to work on. All I know is that I want to make money online and I want to, do something that's modest, but I don't have any ideas of my own. And so I went to Hacker News. And on Hacker News at the time, I think this still happens, but maybe less rarely nowadays because of Indie Hackers, every month or two there would be this giant thread that'd be like, what's your one-person SaaS? Or how do you make money from your side projects? And everyone would sort of dive in and just share the stories of what they're working on. And it was almost entirely programmers working on these side projects. And so I figured I could just go read these threads. And if I read through a few hundred stories, then, maybe pattern recognition would kick in and I would see some sort of like, a light bulb would go off and I would come up with an idea for my own business if I saw other people were making money. And there's really nowhere else online to go at the time to find out how programmers were making apps that were generating revenue online. And it was like I was saying earlier, it was pretty much only the tech press featuring, these giant unicorn companies, and that was it. And so I started reading these stories, and the one that leapt out to me the most was Peter Levels' story. I think he's going to come on the stream later today if he hasn't already. But Peter Levels has a site called Nomad List. And every time one of these threads happened, Peter's comment would be like plastered to the top. It'd have the most upvote because Peter would share every single detail about how he started Nomad List. He would share his revenue. He would share sort of his strategy. And people just liked it. It resonated with people, and it resonated with me too. And so I ended up having exactly what I hoped to have, like sort of this flash of insight moment where like after reading his story so many times and analyzing why Nomad List was successful, and then reading through all these stories in Hacker News, I sort of merged the two to come up with the idea for Indie Hackers. And it's not obvious looking at it from the outside in, but like I'll try to explain the underlying reasons why Nomad List and Indie Hackers are almost the same idea. So for Nomad List, Peter Levels said, hey, I like to be a digital nomad. I want to travel the world and find places to work. But researching this information is extremely difficult. You have to go probably do 100 Google searches just to figure out where to go. So what I'm going to do is compile all this information into one place so that people like me who have the same issue can come and find it and make it really easy for them. So we started off with a spreadsheet. We crowdsourced it. People contributed. We turned that into a website. It was sort of this table where you could go and see all this information. And then at the back of that, he created a newsletter and a community and sort of, kept his traffic coming back, and he kept the list updated. And then he started charging sponsors for ads. And so he had this sort of playbook, like step-by-step process of how exactly he took Nomad List from an idea to a profitable business. And I thought that playbook was genius. So I was like, I'm going to do the exact same thing for Indie Hackers. Like, what's a thing that I'm looking at that I'm trying to research that other people want to know, but it's hard to do? And it turns out it was a process that I was going through, finding all these indie businesses and trying to research, what made them successful and how I could do the same thing. And so sort of looked back at Hacker News and I figured out what stories are the ones that resonate the most. Why do people like some stories, why do people not like other stories? And it was really easy to do because there's literally hundreds of these stories and you could see which ones got upvotes. You could see the questions people were asking in response to the stories. And the number one thing that stood out was stories that shared their revenue numbers were the ones that people liked the most, because you could sort of put it in context, understand how successful this founder was and whether or not it was something that you should pursue or learn from. And so over the next 3 weeks, I decided to create Indie Hackers. And I emailed everyone that I possibly could from these Hacker News threads. I think I sent like 150 emails. I only ended up getting like 9 or 10 interviews. Most people were like, are you crazy? I'm not going to share my revenue. I didn't share it in the Hacker News thread. Why would I share it on your know-nothing, no-name site that no one's ever heard of? But 10 people took a chance and they said yes. And it took me 3 weeks to get their interviews out the door, put them on a website, and launch. And it blew up. I launched in Hacker News, which is the same community where everyone was interested in these stories in the first place. So it wasn't surprising that people in Hacker News liked it. And since then, I've just been working on Indie Hackers full time.
That's awesome. Yeah. So I'll give you a little bit of personal story on my end. When I first saw Indie Hackers, I was going through a particularly tough time. I was kind of similar to you, is where I was like watching every startup school interview and trying to follow their advice, creating this B2B SaaS app that we're trying to be this like the next invoicing app that small businesses will use. And like it was just like we were really, really getting excited about our YC interview, but we didn't have any users. And some of my co-founders, like we're just again subscribing to the tech crunch idea that like we want to be this giant thing. And I remember finding Indie Hackers at that time, and I sometimes it's hard for me to like put my feelings into words, but there was just something about that, seeing that website, that just completely changed my mindset. And I remember actually sending it to my co-founders, who one of them who was an engineer, and he just like didn't get it. He was like, oh, I don't want to be like some like small app. I want to be like, I want to be something big. And then I was like thinking like, this is a pass fail business. And I was thinking like, no, this is what I want to do. And like, maybe it's because I was chasing the personal freedom and, getting out of the full-time job thing. But my question to you off of that is like, it just, because it blew up like crazy, what do you think really resonated with people with Indie Hackers?
I think there's a culture in startup land that you have to be doing it for something bigger than yourself. That the only reason to start a company is to change the world and to make other people's lives better, which is not a bad message. Like there's nothing obviously wrong with making a company to make the world a better place. But let's face it, we're all human beings. We all care about our own lives. We constantly are self-motivated. Like people want financial independence. People want to break free from the cycle of being employed by others. People want to build apps that they enjoy working on. They want to be able to work from wherever they want, on whatever schedule they want, on whatever they want. They want creative freedom. And I think it just was sort of a void where no one was really telling people, hey, you can do this and here's the path to do this. And there's nothing wrong with it whatsoever. And so I think, for someone like you, it's funny, you talked to your coworker and he didn't really get it. He didn't see it and said, no, I only care about building something that's big. Well, that's kind of like an experience in YC as well. Like sort of all the investors had this narrative that for them to make returns on their funds, every one of the companies they invested in needed to go hard or go home. Like it was only, billion or bust. And so that was sort of the message that got disseminated to all the founders and the media outlets as well. And I think, that's not a message that resonates with everybody. For some people, they want to start a business that's a success for themselves and then maybe try something else that's a little bit more ambitious, or it's a little bit bigger and a little more selfless. I think Indie Hackers showed people that it's okay to go the other path. And that's why I was excited to build it. That's why I was excited about the stories in Hacker News. And that's probably why, you and people like yourself found that it really resonated with what you were trying to do.
Did you, one thing that is, hard to tell, like maybe like friends and family or like, the coworker we talked about, like sometimes like, Indie Hackers, like when it first started, it was really just a blog, right? Did you ever feel like self-conscious that you weren't creating like, the next big app, or you were like, you had like worked, you had worked on so many, you have a degree from MIT and you have all this, but obviously Indie Hackers is amazing and it's huge but at the time, it was really just a blog. How was that thought process? Yeah,
it was tough. I will say that if you spend 10 years starting companies and none of them work out the way that you want them to, it's a humbling experience and you sort of forgive yourself for not creating the next big thing. And people who do create the next big thing sort of hog all the press. So it seems like it's a much easier thing and a much more likely thing to happen than it really is. But in reality, like the vast majority of people don't create the next big thing. So it's not that big of a deal. When I was coming up with ideas and I came up with the idea for Indie Hackers, I actually had 2 or 3 other ideas that actually did well on my checklist as well. And Indie Hackers was the only one of those that didn't focus entirely around me sitting down for 6 months and cranking out some app that was going to be super glitzy and special and unique. You're right, it was just a blog. And so even though I thought it was the best idea on my list, it scored the highest on my checklist, I was still hesitant to work on it because I really wanted to use my programming skills and I really wanted to build something that would be cool. And so I sort of made a pact with myself that even though Indie Hackers was just a blog and I could just put it on Medium or WordPress or something, that I would allow myself to code it all from scratch and build the forum from scratch, et cetera, rather than using existing tools. It's sort of a consolation prize to myself for going with an idea that wasn't, what I felt was the most, glitzy or glamorous or programmer oriented. So I thought about it a lot in the early days, but I also knew that I was going to follow Nomad List's model, right? So Peter Levels created Nomad List, but he didn't just keep it as an Excel spreadsheet, he put it on a website. And he didn't just keep that, he also turned it into a community. And he built all sorts of, secondary applications off the back of that. And I thought that was just very inspiring. I thought it was fun. He wasn't really tied down to only building one thing. He could do lots of different things, help people in different ways. And so I knew from the get-go that it wasn't just going to stay a blog forever. It started as a blog. At the bottom of every blog post, there was a little blurb where you could sign up to join the newsletter and get alerted for more interviews like this one. And so pretty quickly, I was up to like 2,000 or 3,000 newsletter subscribers. And then I built this community forum from scratch. And I sort of did the Reddit model of just creating fake accounts and starting these discussions and having discussions with myself to get it going. And then I would email the discussions out to my newsletter, which I'd built off the back of the blog. And so gradually people would come into the forum and they would have these discussions, not knowing that they were really just talking to different versions of me. And after a few months, it sort of gained a life of its own. I didn't have to go to the forum to get these discussions going. People were talking amongst themselves. And so that was always kind of part of the plan.
Yeah.
And, even since then, I've had other plans. I don't think you ever really stop making plans for your business and how it can be bigger and better. And you don't start off huge on day one. You've got to get there incrementally.
Yeah, a common theme that I've seen from all the interviews I've done and also Nomad List is, I think, expectations. So not saying you had low expectations, but sometimes having lower expectations when you start. It seems like all the successful products that I've talked about in my interviews, they all had pretty low expectations and quick time to MVP. So I'm curious, what were your expectations for Indie Hackers before you launched and then throughout the year before the acquisition?
My expectations before I launched was that the launch would go well. I built this website based on stories that were popular in Hacker News. It's catered toward the Hacker News audience. I'm going to launch it on Hacker News. Step one, the launch should go well, and I should get people on my mailing list, and then we'll figure it out from there. And I think you're right. The fact that it only took me 2 or 3 weeks in the beginning to get it up is helpful. I find the same exact thing when I interview people on Indie Hackers. Like Josh Pigford from Baremetrics is one of my favorite examples. He conceived of the idea for Baremetrics and built the MVP and had his first paying customer in something like 7-8 days. And I think the average time on Indie Hackers is 3 weeks. Wow. The longer you go building something in obscurity and not showing it to anybody and not trying to sell it, the more likely you are to just give up and quit and say, I'm not that enthused about this idea. And so that was one of the things on my checklist. Can I build this app in a very short amount of time and get it out the door? Because I'd made that mistake of getting bored working on things for a long time in the past. And I'm sure you've had similar experiences. Like, how long did it take you to start Starter Story?
Yeah, about a month.
Yeah, about a month. So it's right in that 3 4 week period. Yeah. That's I think the sweet spot where you can do enough to be not that embarrassed about what you're working on, but you're not spending so much time on polishing everything and adding every one of your pet features that you're going to get discouraged and build all the wrong stuff and just lose steam.
Yeah. One thing that hopefully resonates with you and with Starter Story as well is because it's content that you're releasing, you have ultimate opportunities to launch and grow for infinity, I guess, right? Oftentimes when you launch an app or a SaaS app, you have to it's a lot harder to relaunch. And I know that some of your interviews just really, really went big. And I'm wondering, how did the content model change how you think about indie businesses?
Content is cool because it's made for spreading on the internet. Almost every channel that we use, every communication channel that we use supports sharing URLs, and content is shareable just by putting a URL in there. And so I'd never built a content site before. I'd only ever built SaaS apps where there's this huge sell you have to make. Here's the problem that it's going to solve, and here's why you should sign up and create an account. But content's instantly consumable. You can submit it to Hacker News, you can submit it to Reddit, you can share it on an email, a chat message on Twitter. And so I thought it was really fun to work on a content site because I could sit down, do an interview, and 6 hours later see the numbers and the traffic rise on the site, whereas everything else in the past, it was just such a long feedback loop, long turnaround time. And so it was really encouraging. I think you learn a lot faster when you have that short feedback loop. You can constantly put out new pieces of content, tweak them based on reception to the old pieces of content. Whereas with the SaaS app, you're sort of building these features for months at a time, and then you have to dive into the metrics to even try to learn a lesson, and even then it's hard to learn the right lessons. And so I'm pretty bullish on content sites. I think people who start sites that teach people lessons, that educate people, that help people learn different things are sort of almost always going to be more successful than people who try to build these complicated SaaS apps. And that's not to say that SaaS doesn't work. Like obviously there's many very successful SaaS businesses, but a lot of those are also powered by content. Sites like Intercom or Zapier put a lot of time into their blogs and writing content that resonates with people and that teaches people how to do things, and that's sort of what gets people in the door, and then they check out the actual product offering. So I wish that I had spent my 20s and earlier in my career writing more content and getting used to doing things like that. I'd always treated the blog as sort of an afterthought. But Indie Hackers is the opposite. The content came first, and then the community, and the forum, etc.
Yeah, and that one thing I love about the content model too is it was really conducive to getting things done with my full-time job. One of the struggles that I had with the failed SaaS app was I had to jump out of my full-time job to take sales demos and fix critical bugs, and I actually just quit my full-time job. But I was able to make really great progress on content because it's not. Bugs aren't really that important for a blog or a content website or something where you're teaching people. So I was able to make a lot of progress and also be, effective at my full-time job at the same time, and also generate revenue.
Yeah, I was at MicroConf both this year and last year. I don't remember which year it was, but Patrick McKenzie, Patio 11, gave this talk where he was sort of talking about how hard it is to start a software business. And he had the slide where there was 2 columns of just tasks. And it was bug testing and deployment and all sorts of different things. And he's like, these are all tasks that you have to do to start a software business. And not a single one of them actually makes you money or teaches you anything about your customer. It's all overhead just to get a product out the door. So I think, when you start something that's content or start something that's lighter weight, where you can provide value to people immediately without having to spend, weeks of your life coding, then you can really learn those lessons and start doing sales and start talking to people and running your actual business much faster.
Yeah. So then just want to bring up the Stripe acquisition. How long did that happen after you started the business?
Yeah, I think it was about 9 months. So I launched Indie Hackers August 11th, 2016, and Patrick reached out to me the first week of March in 2017. It was completely unexpected. I had this list of sponsors that I had where it was I think these companies would be perfect to sponsor Indie Hackers, to sponsor the podcast and the website and the newsletter. And I was sort of working my way from the bottom up. So I ranked them from who's got the most money and would be the best fit, all the way down to who's the least money and be the worst fit. And Stripe was at the very top of the list. It was this is a perfect fit for Stripe. But that was all internal. I never actually got to the point where I'd worked up my list and had reached out to Stripe when out of the blue, Patrick just sent me this email and was like, hey, can we acquire Indie Hackers? What would you think about that? And I think he was nervous because just the name of the site suggests that not for sale. This is not something that you could buy. This is an ND venture. But I think it was about 9 months from the time that I started Indie Hackers to the time that Patrick emailed me, and then maybe 4 days from the time that he sent me that email to the time that he actually sent me an offer. It was super fast.
Wow. Yeah, so I'm sure that did come as a surprise, but I think a lot of people, when they saw that, it made sense. And it also showed that Stripe, how cool of a company Stripe is because they value those things.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was pretty awesome.
Yeah, I don't think very many companies would have bought Indie Hackers. And it's funny because a lot of people did get it and a lot of people didn't get it and still don't get it. But I think Patrick is in particular sort of a big thinker. He doesn't necessarily limit himself to doing things that are easily measurable. There's lots of things that can have an impact, but it's hard to put that impact into a spreadsheet. And for Stripe, inspiring more people to start more businesses is huge, right? Those businesses will probably use Stripe one day. It's good for the world. It's good for Stripe. And so Stripe does a lot of sort of off-the-wall things that other companies would never do, just to help more people start companies. So they've got Stripe Press nowadays. I think they sort of launched that a month or two ago. But we're literally just publishing books. They'll educate people and founders and help them build better companies. And who knows how many people are going to read those books and make better decisions. There's no real way to measure what the actual economic impact will be, but for a fact that it's greater than zero. And I think Patrick is sort of unique in that he's willing to, and Stripe as a whole, really, as a company, is just willing to take those risks and make those bets and work on things that don't necessarily have an obvious payoff.
Was that one of the reasons why you agreed to it, because it was Stripe?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, just talking to Patrick, knowing Stripe's reputation, um, looking at sort of the incentives and the desires of everybody involved. So it's like you could look at it as there really being three parties. There's me and what I want for indie hackers. There's Stripe and what they want for Stripe, and then there's sort of the indie hackers audience and what they want for indie hackers. And I thought that the Stripe acquisition made things better for all three of those parties. Stripe didn't change my goals at all. It's like I really want to inspire people to start companies and teach them how to do it. They're like, that's what we want to do too. And so we were perfectly aligned. And the indie hackers audience wants me to do the same thing. And so the fact that Stripe could sort of fund that and help indie hackers grow to become more impactful and better, and I don't have to spend all my time selling ads, which by the time indie hackers got acquired, I was spending about half of my time just talking to advertisers and helping them write ad copy and selling ads. Like that's not beneficial to anyone really, except for me. And so I think it was sort of a win-win-win situation. It wasn't a difficult thing to consider.
Yeah. Okay. So just two more questions. I'm really interested in the meetup stuff that you're doing. Like I think it's awesome because it really is spreading the word about indie hackers. Like I used to live in New York, and I got just like a Facebook invitation from a friend that I didn't even know was an indie hacker, and it was for an indie hackers meetup. So I think that's super cool, and also like
that's cool,
really unique. You don't see websites doing like large scale meetups. So I'm curious how that's going and why you decided to go bullish on that.
Yeah, it's going really well. I mentioned earlier, I think that I spent the last 8 or 9 days traveling. I just got back home on Thursday, but I was in an indie hackers meetup in Dublin. There were 70 people there. I was in London last Saturday. There was like 60, 65 people there. I was in Toronto on my way back home. There's 25 people there. And in that span of time, I also missed like 6 or 7 other indie hackers meetups that are going on in Paris and all sorts of other countries around the world. And so it's a real thing now. People are meeting each other all over. And I think it's cool because when you run a website, like everybody's got Google Analytics. You all know your metrics. You see if someone comes to your site, maybe you've got one person, maybe you have 100, maybe you have 1,000 people coming to your site, but those numbers aren't that tangible. But when you can like fly around and see what a room full of 100 people looks like, it's pretty magical. So I found myself like working extra hard and being super extra enthusiastic the last 4 days just coming back from that trip. But the meetups are something that we started doing. Well, we didn't even really start doing them. It started happening like last year without us doing anything. So a lot of people in the community and the forums said, hey, we're going to do a meetup. I think one of them happened in New York without any intervention or effort on my part. And by the time we actually put a meetups page on the site, there had already been half a dozen indie hackers meetups in person. And so we're just kind of like, hey, come here, make a meetup. If you're traveling to a city and you want to meet like-minded people, put a meetup on indiehackers.com. We'll help you out. Or if you want to post meetups in your own city, put it on indiehackers.com. And I think we started taking applications for people to become official Indie Hackers community ambassadors, which if you're listening, you should definitely consider doing it. The only responsibility is you run a meetup in your city once a month. So you can just go to indiehackers.com and search for community ambassador, and you'll find a post. You can sign up. But I think something like 150 people applied the first time we put out the call, and maybe we accepted like 100 of them. And nowadays we have like anywhere between 30 to 50 meetups happening every month without us having to do very much at all. The meetups that I flew to last week, I didn't organize any of those. Those were all organized by Indie Hackers community members, and every one of them was completely different. One of them was sort of a live podcast session. One of them was a hackathon. One of them was an unconference session where you just write down what you want to talk about and break into groups and talk about it. People just do dinners. People do beers. Some people play poker. Some people do outdoor activities. Some people just do co-working. So the meetups are a really cool phenomenon, and I think they are another good example of something that slots into this sort of mold where it's hard to measure what the impact is going to be. What happens when somebody goes to a meetup and they meet someone that inspires them to start a company, right? You can't really pinpoint that or measure that, but like you can sort of trust that there will be beneficial effects. And Patrick at Stripe has been like really bullish on the meetups, more bullish than I was at first, because this fits sort of perfectly in his philosophy of the types of things you should be doing.
That's awesome. Okay, last question, and I'll let you go. What kind of advice? So a lot of people doing the 24-hour startup are first-time makers, not even really thinking too much about the monetization part. What kind of advice do you have for them to get their name out there have a successful launch and then continue to market their products, or maybe figure out they should work on something else?
Yeah, I did an AMA on Indie Hackers earlier this week, and someone asked me something similar. And my response is that there is no one size fits all advice. As disappointing as that is to hear, everyone needs to hear different things. There's some people who need to hear that they need to spend more time reading and studying and educating themselves. There's some people who need to hear the exact opposite message. They need to spend less time doing that and more time actually building. But I do find myself saying a few of the same things over and over again, just to different people at different times. I find myself saying that people should charge more money. And this is something that it's really counterintuitive. I said this a lot actually at the London meetup after people were sort of presenting their ideas, and almost every idea where anyone had any sort of price tag attached, I thought they were charging something like anywhere from 10 to 100 times less money than they should be. Charging more money for your product is one of these scary things where like, you built it, and it's easy to get into this sort of belief system where you think that because you built it so easily, anyone else could build it and therefore it can't be worth that much money. When the reality is most people aren't thinking about building their own tools. Most people can't build their own tools. And most people who can are like not interested in building the thing that you built. And so you should really be thinking about how much value you can provide to your customers. And it's almost always a lot more than you initially think it is. And it's one of these things where like the price that you charge for your product isn't this isolated thing. It's not like just a number that's sort of free floating in space. It affects every other part of your business too. If you charge more money for what you're doing, then you sort of price out certain customers and you become only viable to other customers who can afford to pay that. And that means you sort of change like what features your product needs to have, because those customers want different features than the low cost customers. And it changes how you find them, right? Maybe you have to use sales instead of marketing, et cetera. And so I don't think it's one of those things where you can sort of treat it like it's its own like free floating entity that's irrelevant to everything else. You should try to charge more from the get-go, and then think about what kind of value you need to provide to your customers in order to like justify that price, and think about what kinds of customers will pay that price. And I think it's one of those things that just sort of makes every part of your business better when you charge more money. Other things I say a lot are, don't fear sales. People are really afraid of sales. Everyone wants to build a business that's just like, they put it on Hacker News and it just blows up and it's just marketing and that's all it takes. But sales is a lot easier because you talk to people one-on-one, they give you feedback, they tell you why they won't buy or why they will buy, and you actually learn valuable lessons. Whereas marketing is kind of like you make a landing page and no one gives you any feedback on it whatsoever. And you don't even know who's seeing it. And you don't know why they don't click to buy. And it's just much harder to do. So I think there's sort of a gap in the market where there's not enough indie hackers building businesses that could be supported by sales. B2B over B2C every day. Sell to other businesses. Businesses have more money to spend. They have more reasons to spend money. You're going to have an easier time if you build something that helps businesses solve problems. Don't be so obsessed with solving a unique problem. I think everybody wants their idea to be unique. Everybody thinks that an idea is good if the idea itself is like this sort of unicorn idea that no one's ever heard of before. But I think the reality is most problems and most businesses that make money solve really like, I don't know, boring old school problems. Like restaurants all solve the same problem. You need to eat. Tons of people are solving the problem of helping companies hire programmers or helping people learn to code. Like these are boring problems that aren't new. But that doesn't mean that your solution has to be boring. Like you can solve a boring problem, but bring like a really unique solution to that problem, and that can help you stand out, while also guaranteeing that you're not solving some sort of problem that like nobody has or nobody's going to pay money for. If I was going to start a business and my goal was to achieve some sort of financial independence, I would look at the problems that people are already paying a lot of money to solve, but that aren't necessarily adequately solved or perfectly solved by any one company, and find a unique way to position myself to help solve that problem, if that makes sense. Other than that, I would say, have fun. It's hopefully whatever you're working on is something that you actually enjoy working on. Otherwise, you're probably not going to stick with it for the years that it takes to build a successful company. People really underestimate this, but it's like consistently true among the people that I talk to. If there's not something about your company that you really like doing, if there's not something about your goal you're striving for that really lights a fire under your ass, then when the day comes that you have to wake up and do a bunch of drudge work that you don't want to do, like you're going to quit because there's nothing keeping you going. So don't underestimate that. That was front and center at the very top of my checklist when I decided what I wanted to work on.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, that's all the questions I have for you. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Let me ask you a few questions if you got time.
Yeah, of course. How's
the startup challenge going? How's it been?
It's been awesome, man. We launched it. So I don't know if you saw, but I did a 24-hour startup myself, just me. Mm-hmm. And I launched a a product where you can make a blog out of Google Docs. And it was like this kind of cool product. I called it You Don't Need WordPress. I built it in 24 hours, did it on stream, and it kind of like blew up because like Ryan Hoover had commented on it. So I had like 10,000 people watch it, and it like went #1 on Hacker News or Product Hunt and all that.
Yeah.
So that was awesome, and people, were just telling me that they were inspired by it and stuff. So I had the idea over the last month to make it like a global challenge, to like organize it and package it up into something that other people can do. So I didn't really act on it right away, but then about 2 weeks ago, I realized that I actually just quit my job, and Starter Story is like kind of a little bit dead because of the holidays. Like it's just hard to do too much because e-commerce is really busy during this time.
Yeah.
So I was like, all right, I want to do this, but I need to do it before Thanksgiving. So like 2 weeks ago, me and Armin and Melanie, who are also working on it, we got a landing page up in one day, and then we got Product Hunt post the next day. We had we like opened it for 50, then we opened it for 100, then we opened it for 200, and then we got 500 signups, and then
congrats!
Yeah,
it's exciting.
Thanks. And then so then I just started trying to hustle as many sponsors as I can and raise the stakes, and we raised like $4,000. Got tons of people involved, and
another, by the way, situation where I would say charge more, because you messaged me asking if Indie Hackers could be a sponsor, and I think I was traveling, so I was like really slow on email. I still like 100 emails in my inbox, but I didn't know the pricing, and I was basically like, yeah, I'm going to be a sponsor. I don't really care what the price is. And I think you told me the upper limit was $500. I was like, oh, if you'd said $2,000, I'd have been like, here you go, we'll sponsor for $2,000. But charge more, Pat.
That's a mistake I made, because I would reach out to people and I'd say, okay, if you can make a donation between $100 and $500, and then anytime I asked that, they would only send me 100, no matter what. No one ever sent me more than the amount.
No. Yeah, you capped them.
So yeah, I mean, it's going like super well, and I personally think, and my two co-founders on this, we have something here, like some sort of streaming model, community, just like we've been working really hard to market it, but we got a Telegram group of like 400 people without really trying, and people are really, really excited about it. So my question back to you is like, what do you think about it?
I think it's great. I think the ability to inspire people is something that's really underrated. I didn't fully appreciate it until months into running Indie Hackers, when I saw that people are actually starting stuff because of the stories that they're reading, and it's not just some isolated phenomenon. And I can sort of draw it back to my own behavior. And like, I guess I was also inspired by reading other people's stuff. So like anything that does inspiration at scale, I think is not only really good for the world, but just like really fun to work on. Yeah. Like I think you seem to be having a good time, and I like this sort of live video model where everybody's sort of working at the same time, and everybody feels connected, even though they're in disparate locations. I think that's really one of the hardest things about being an indie hacker, is if you're going to sit down and build something from scratch, you don't have an office, you don't have people working with you most likely, and it can get pretty lonely. It's one of the biggest problems, and I think something like this helps relieve people of their loneliness, and capping it to one day also forces people to get something done and not make some of these mistakes that you see made over and over. People work on something for 6 months and then just give up. So there's a lot of stuff that I like about it. I hope you keep doing it, and I hope Indie Hackers can be a part of it.
Yeah. Cool, man. Well, thanks for coming
All
on.
right.
Where can
anytime.
Where can the audience find you?
I'm on Twitter at CSAllen, ALLEN, IndyHackers.com. That's NDINDIE. Go to this 24-hour startup challenge website. I'm sure our logo's on there since we're a sponsor now. And just click through to Indie Hackers. But that's pretty much it. I welcome everybody who's listening to come check out the site, ask a question. If you're working on a startup, the community is more than happy to help you. And please, if you're ever interested in meeting people who are interested in the same things that you are, go to IndyHackers.com/meetups, host a meetup. We'll help you get people from whatever city you started in.
Cool. All right, man. Thanks for coming on, especially on a weekend.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Pat, and best of luck.
See ya.